Well, welcome everyone. This is Patricia, who I know is the real reason that everyone is here. My name is Andrew McMillan, and this is the first ever Poetry Book Society live online book club through Instagram. So thank you very much for joining us, and I hope that it's going to be an enjoyable little chat. I was sat downstairs last night with Patricia and with my boyfriend, and we were watching this original Broadway production of Cats, the musical. And it's a very strange thing to watch, and it struck me that actually it's quite a celebration of the weirdness and the intelligence and the insight of T.S. Eliot, who of course wrote the original poems that became the musical Cats, but he also founded the Poetry Book Society about 5 decades ago, and so that's my strange segue into being able to talk about the Poetry Book Society. The Poetry Book Society are a fantastic organisation that if you're not already a member, then I urge you to join up and to become a member in whatever way you can. And so there are different levels of membership. You can choose to receive the choice every quarter, so every season, spring, summer, autumn, winter. And in fact, the PBS have got a special offer on at the minute that Patricia's very excited about, even if she doesn't look it. She's had a long day. She's been preparing for this for a long time. She's been doing her makeup. But at the minute, the Poetry Book Society have got a great offer on where if you join up to be a choice member at the minute, you'll get a free copy of the Spring 2020 Bulletin and also a copy of... Oh, I'm back, don't worry. My phone got too excited by this offer. Also a copy of Rendang by Will Harris, this great debut. Will Harris's first book, but also Granta's first poetry book from this new imprint that Granta Poetry are doing as well. And so if you join up to be a choice member of the PBS right now, you'll get a free copy of Rendang. That was the Spring 2020 choice, and the Summer 2020 choice that I had a hand in choosing on a cold day in January is How to Wash a Heart by the great Banu Kapil, and that's published by Pavilion Poetry, a relatively new imprint that's based up in Liverpool. And so if you join up as a choice member to the Poetry Book Society, you'll be able to get a copy of Banu Kapil's book How to Wash a Heart as well, and I really recommend that, and I'm really looking forward to be able to chat with you about that in the coming days and weeks, as we do, hopefully, if this goes well and I don't kill Patricia, I don't kill anyone and my phone doesn't explode, hopefully we can do more of these online book clubs as we go along. So my name's Andrew McMillan. I'm a selector for the Poetry Book Society. For the summer choices that we're going to be talking about, one of those this evening, I actually chose those with Sandeep Parmar, the fantastic Sandeep, who was a selector for 2 years before I stepped in. And so I did kind of one with Sandeep, which is the ones that we're going to talk about this evening. And now I'm lucky enough to be selecting with Sinead Morrissey, the great Sinead Morrissey. And so the selections that me and Sinead have just made for autumn 2020 should be announced in the next few weeks, and there's some fantastic books in there as well. But just to remind you what the summer 2020 selections were, so the books that you're going to be able to get a hold of and get your hands on if you join up to the Poetry Book Society. The choice for summer 2020, as I've said, is Banu Kapil's How to Wash a Heart, and then we have 4 incredible recommendations as well. So we've got Ella Frears' debut book, Shine Darling, The Offord Road, published through another great new independent press, and another debut book that really dazzled me and Sandeep. We've got Ranjit Hoskote's The Atlas of Lost Beliefs that ARC publications have done. So ARC, another great independent publisher that do a lot of work in translation, that are based up here in the north of England. And so it's great to have them on this recommendation list as well. And then a really exciting book that's coming over to us in June from the United States is Banu Kapil's How to Wash a Heart. Is Natalie Diaz's post-colonial love poem. And That's coming out by Faber in the next couple of months. And it's just an astonishing book that explores a kind of indigenous American experience in the United States of America. I can see people asking questions. Yes, Patricia is snoring, but she's snoring with joy. And I'm just going to get my glasses on so I can see some of the questions. Patricia's snoring with joy. Shawn will be joining us in a little bit as well. Don't panic. I know you're really here to see Shawn and Patricia. I'm just part of the window dressing. And I can see someone saying that How to Wash a Heart arrived today, which is fantastic. It's like one long experimental poem that you just dive straight into. So I would say don't start reading it until you know you've got time to finish it, because otherwise you'll be stuck just kind of falling through these stanzas, through these lines that occur. So tonight, those are the kind of other choices. But tonight we've got Tongues of Fire by Seán Hewitt, which is another one of the Poetry Book Society recommendations for summer 2020, and the one that we're going to be kicking off this new experiment with as well. You can see Patricia sniffing it kind of interestedly. She's read it a couple of times, but she always wants to go back for more. And so the way that this will work tonight, and hopefully in kind of subsequent editions as well, is that I'll talk a little bit about the book. I might read out a couple of the poems that I think could be really interesting, and then hopefully as well I'm going to bring Shawn into the conversation in a little while. I'm going to get him to read a couple of poems to us, and then give you guys a chance as well to ask any questions that you want. So I've got my glasses on now, and Patricia is going to be question monitor. She's going to be our Fiona Bruce, and we'll kind of field the questions as they come through from you guys who are watching on Instagram, and we'll see how it goes. What's the worst that could happen is what I'm thinking. So if I'm looking down at my desk, it's not because I'm bored of you, it's because these are my notes, and I like to be prepared. I like to put in some effort into what we're doing. And so Shawn's debut collection, so like Ella Freer's book as well, we've got 2 debuts on the PBS recommended lists this time, and I think that's really exciting. That one of the things I think that marked out Sandeep and Vijay Ravindran's reign as Poetry Book Society selectors was the amount of debuts which came to the fore. So Will Harris's that we've just seen, we had Rachel Allen, we had Raymond Antrobus, all as PBS choices, and I think it's this really exciting moment where we see a new generation of poets step forward, of which Ella Freer's is one. We can talk about her in a later edition of this live book club, and Seán Hewitt tonight. And if you have a look on the Poetry Book Society website, there's the kind of official blurb and the official write-up of the book. But I thought I'd just try and talk us through a bit about why me and Sandeep had chosen this book, and why I think it has spoke to us both so powerfully. So I guess almost like Robert Frost when he talks about those 2 roads, those 2 paths that diverge for him. Coming to Seán Hewitt's debut collection feels like standing at a meeting point of a lot of different tributaries. In this book, I think you can definitely feel that kind of presence of people like Michael Longley and Seamus Heaney. There's that real kind of quality of an Irish pastoral, I think, in his work, and that kind of mythological voice, that mythic voice that often comes through in Irish poetry. And yet Mark Doty's in this book as well, I think. I think the great American poet Mark Doty is there as that kind of queer, longing voice that comes through in Shawn's work. I think Sharon Olds is there in her bravery and her confessionalism. Gerard Manley Hopkins is kind of hovering somewhere above. And all these different influences come together into a voice that I think is, and Patricia thinks as well, is just kind of startlingly sincere and lyrical. One of the things that maybe me and Shawn and you guys can chat about with us in a bit is how fashions kind of shift in poetry, that a while ago it seemed maybe that hyper-irony was the thing, and now maybe radical sincerity is partly having its day again. And one of the things I think that really interests me about Tongues of Fire, which you'll find if you come to read it, if you've not yet, is the fact that it has this central conceit. So this notion of communing with nature, and particularly woodland, this notion of communing with the woods and with nature but then almost like this series of nesting dolls. All these other themes and all these other ideas are kind of built inside of it, I think. And so nature becomes a way to talk about sexual encounter, to talk about personal relationships, suicide attempts, birth, grief. They're all somehow nested within that wide open space of the natural landscape, and with that, in that enclosed, sometimes quite gloomy and murky space of the woodland. It feels like a really important thing to say as well, that I guess we might think of this as a confessional, quote-unquote, book, whatever we mean by that, whatever we might mean by confessional poetry. But as we know, all confessional poetry is just an act. It's just a trick of the light. It's just a mirror to hold up and show you something that's kind of really behind it, I think. And what is brilliant about this book is the way that Shawn might show you that individual leaf, the individual branch, the tree, but that's not really what's important in this book. That's not really why we're interested in those poems, not on any deep level anyway. What's truly important, I think, about some of these poems that I think we'll hear when Shawn reads them, I might read out a couple, is the way that these poems act as a window and a kind of screen, I think, down to something that, through to something that's much more important and much more resonant, I guess, for us all. And so I guess that's a lot of waffle, but what I'm saying is that this book is hard to place in one family tree. It's hard to trace the genealogy of this book. Most books, especially by new poets, you could sort of say, oh, they're clearly influenced by X or Y, they're clearly influenced by this person or that person. What I think makes this debut stand out is that it's influenced by a lot of different voices. And what I always say to my writing students, what I always say to my creative writing students is read as widely as possible, read across as many genres as possible, and then in the end, you'll come out with a voice which is uniquely your own, which only you could have written. And I think that that's what Shawn has managed to do in this collection, and I think that's one of the reasons why it does really speak to me. Welcome to people that are joining us as we go along. We're here with Poetry Book Society for the first live book club. We're talking about Tongues of Fire by Seán Hewitt, and I thought that to kind of kick us off, I guess by thinking about specific poems, I'd read the poem called Evening Poem, which is on page 37 if you're reading along with the book, and this is just a poem that I've come actually quite a bit to use in teaching, because it seems to me to do this great job of balance. One of the things that I always say to my poetry students, one of the things that I always think about writing poetry, is that we think of it like music. So you might say, I'm going to compose a poem in the same way that we might compose a piece of music. And one of the things that has always struck me about music is that unless you listen to Scandinavian death metal music, very little music is just loud right at the start and maintains its loudness all the way to the end. There are quiet moments and loud moments. There are moments of crescendo and trough, and so that's what we should aim for in poetry. And I just think this poem does that quite remarkably well. Look how, in particular, I think, as I read this poem out, for that final line that's going to come up, and all the lines of poetry in my life that I think I could recite back, that I can remember, are the plainest lines. So where all poetry kind of stands back. So if you think of the end of Elizabeth Bishop's Filling Station, somebody loves us all. If you think about the end of Larkin's, one of Larkin's great end lines, what will survive of us is love. And those are the kind of lines that have always really stuck with me, because they seem to step beyond poetry. And I think the final line of Evening Poem does that as well. And I can see somebody mentioning Lantern, which of course was Shawn's pamphlet, which was shortlisted for the Michael Marks Award, and which a few of the poems from that pamphlet appear in this book, not many of them, but a few of them. And I think people that have read that will know the quality of what to expect. But this is Evening Poem. First, the clatter iron blackbird, its fanatical shuddering, in the magnolia. Dusk, and the garden is reassembling, calling its sparrows home. And what are voice rackets under the okiba, doors closing too, and each sparrow an iron filing sweeping the field lines of the garden. I sit out in the last warmth and watch it all come to rest, the light falling, the thrushes settling in the sycamores at the far end of the lawn, how each tree lowers itself under a new weight, and I hold out for a while, for everything to darken, for the birds to stop singing, as though I am teaching myself again to bear it. And it's that final line that always really hits me, as though I am teaching myself again to bear it. And that just seems such a powerful kind of turn in this poem, which before, as I said, has been so balanced between these plain statements and between these moments of what I guess we might think of as capital P poetry, moments where the kind of poem, moments I guess where the poem steps on to a kind of lyrical plane, perhaps you might call it. So that opening statement, first the clatter-iron blackbird and its fanatical shuddering in the magnolia. So there's something in that where that's poetry, that's pure poetry. And then at the end, as though I'm teaching myself again to bear it, there's just a kind of starkness to that and a kind of plainness to that. And I'm fascinated by, I guess, the balance of those two things and what that might mean. There's another poem towards the beginning of the book called Dormancy. Patricia's just tired because she's been playing out all day. We've been painting, we've been running around, we've been chasing flies. She's got paint on herself. She's had a busy day. But she's still excited. She's alive as well, I promise. She's not just a kind of prop that the Poetry Book Society have given me. She's a living, breathing pug called Patricia. The name wasn't my idea, but now we're stuck with it. There's a poem earlier on in the book as well called Dormancy, which again I think just really sums up this ability to, I think, marry the natural world with other things. And so, you know, when I first started writing poetry, I was always kind of interested in kind of how I wrote about the physical body, how I wrote about the physical self, how I wrote about the sexual self. And because I'm not that smart, and maybe I'm not that talented, that was the kind of sum total of what I wanted to do. I only wanted to write about the body. And one of the magical things about Shawn's book is the way that it writes about the body, but kind of brings that into other things as well. And I think that this poem Dormancy just really sums that up. So I'll read that for us. Yes, I will. And then maybe I can see by the magic of technology if Patricia can summon Shawn into the room as well. So this is Dormancy. Delicate, grown old in its separation, a witch elm can send itself to seed, can sow from its body these translucent frailties, like hanging wombs, ghosts of seed speaking in their dried out bristle of tree skin. Just so, visiting you on the ward where death had been taken, locked into the matron's safe. You who knew how separate a person is, how deep a root can search into darkness unobstructed. After seeing you so sexless, unable, I sowed myself like a witch elm in a windless room. And so that kind of, again, that turn at the end, that ability to turn the poem at the end, and it changes from just being something about the body, about the frailty of the body, about the kind of pain of the body, and becomes something kind of where the natural world enters that poem as well. And so what I'm going to try and do now, I know you can hear her breathing. She's fine. She's just the quality of being a pug. It is, as someone said, I think, like an ASMR video. It can be relaxing for us all as we kind of chat to Shawn. What I'm going to attempt to do now is kind of bring Shawn into the conversation and then see how that goes. And I agree, just by the way, with one of the comments that's just come up on the screen about needing more BAME voices. Absolutely right, in poetry. One of the great things about the selection of poems that we've got for the Poetry Book Society Summer 2020 is that, not by design, but just by bent of picking the best books, it's incredibly diverse and a rich list, which hopefully we're going to be able to bring you over the coming weeks and months in the Poetry Book Club. So Ranjit Hoskote, Banu Kapil, Natalie Diaz. So poems and poets coming from different experiences and different parts of the world, in fact. And so if you have a look at the selections that the Poetry Book Society has been making over the last few quarters, you'll see a fantastic range of not only BAME voices, but actually in terms of from this country, but voices from around the world, from a whole range of different perspectives and a whole range of different ethnicities, which I think is really vital and really exciting as well. So thank you for that comment, because I think it's worth really bearing in mind. And welcome to the people that are still joining us. And now, this might all go horribly wrong, so if it does, it's been nice knowing you. I think we've bonded about this. Patricia's had a nice time, which is really all that matters. But hopefully, what is going to happen now is that Shawn is over in Dublin, and we're going to try and bring him in. So there might be a sort of 30-40 second bump where we kind of try and do that. But then hopefully Shawn will be here to have that conversation with us. So I've now... And Shawn is being dialed up. It's like Eurovision. We're going to go live to Shawn in Dublin, and he's going to give us the points. Hello, Shawn.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I was just thinking this is like Eurovision. Can you tell us how many points for Iceland, please?
Definitely no point. Oh no, the Iceland song was great this year. I'm so sorry they had to cancel it.
That's some niche knowledge. That's fantastic. Well, thank you very much for joining us. Whereabouts are you, Shawn? Whereabouts are you and where are you joining us from?
I am in my living room in Dublin. I just moved into a new apartment, so I'm just settling in. It's very hot here today, which is nice.
Very hot in Dublin. Who knew? I didn't know they had southern Ireland.
Yeah.
That's not true, Instagram followers. That was a joke. How's the new flat treating you? How's it going?
It's very well. I mean, we have a lovely living room with loads of windows, but it's like a conservatory in here at the moment. It's boiling hot, which is why I look so hot and I'm in a t-shirt. Wait, no, let's see if I can show you. We have a lovely church spire outside, and then if I take you to the balcony, we have the Dublin mountains. You can see them off the balcony, so it's very nice.
Fantastic. Well, congratulations on being a PBS recommendation for summer 2020 with this fantastic debut book, Tongues of Fire. We can have a chat about that in a little bit, and I think people have probably got some questions that they want to ask you as well. But do you want to start off by maybe reading us a poem, if that's all right?
Yeah,
fantastic.
Of course. I thought I would start off with a poem set here in Dublin, because it seemed like the right thing to do since we're going international. So this is a poem, and it has a bit of context to it, which I'll give. It's called Old Crochan Man, which is the name of a bog body, and the remains are in the National Museum here in Dublin. So you kind of remember Heaney's bog body poems in North.
Never heard of it.
And so this one comes with an epigraph, though. So I'll read you the epigraph, and then I'll read the poem. The epigraph is, "Their nipples were cut, thus rendering them ineligible for kingship. The suckling of a king's nipples was an important gesture of submission." So one thing about Old Crochan Man is he's very tall, they figured out. He was 6'5". He has both his nipples cut off, which they figured was perhaps because you needed someone to suckle your nipples in order to give you the power of being king. You needed people to submit to you, and by cutting off his nipples, they made it so that he couldn't be a kink. So this is the poem. Only a torso now, the head long severed from the neck, pelvis twisted off like a stubborn root. Remember the worn jacket of his body pressed in the bog. Above, the galaxies of cotton grass turned inside out, like little souls among the eyebrights, the stitchwork. No place to leave a man alone. And under each nipple, a deep incision, blade width. Even then, they needed boys like me to leave power in our wake, to dip our heads and take to the soft pink mound. I would have felt then the making of a king, known God through my lips, entering the body.
Thank you so much, Sean, for sharing that beautiful poem. And I don't think anyone's ever said the word nipple so many times before the watershed live on Instagram, but that's okay.
You could never.
And I guess that one of the interesting things about that poem, I guess, is it sums up a lot of what I think I was trying to get at during my introduction and during the first kind of part of the discussion of this book, where we're sort of thinking about myth, we're thinking about history, we're thinking about the natural world, but then also the kind of queer body and of sex as well. And it seems that all those things, for you in your poetry, they can't be separated. They're kind of intertwined in that way, aren't they? They can't be pulled apart. And is that fair, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's fair. I mean, it always struck me, primarily I began writing what we might call like nature poems, thinking about the natural world. And I had such an issue, I think, with the idea in eco-poetry of taking away the lyric I, and sort of the idea of trying to see the natural world from its own point of view. Because it felt to me to be such a poetic conceit and almost a lie, to pretend that the poem wasn't coming from a person. It seemed kind of unhelpful. And so I started to explore the ways that we personally filter through nature, and then there are moments when I'm trying to look at it in its own terms, I suppose. But yeah, centering the body was a key thing, and one of the few, I suppose, conscious decisions that I felt that I made in the book. There weren't many decisions that I was aware of at the time, I suppose.
That notion of the lyric I think, is really interesting. I mean, one of the things that I said in my introduction was there was the point where, certainly when I was first starting to write poetry, that the fashion was of a kind of hyper irony or kind of hyper ironized stuff. And it seems like in the last few years we've had people come along who not necessarily reject that, but have decided that actually, as you called it, the lyric I, or the lyric poetry, actually still has something very important to do. And I think that is it fair to say that comes through very strongly in this book as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a very sarcastic person in real life, so I don't think I need any more of it in the poems. I think a poem is a nice place to actually just think honestly about something. And it always struck me with ironic poems that I never wanted the sense that the poem felt itself to be cleverer than its reader. And I think that was really important to me. I never wanted to speak to a reader from a distance, or speak about the idea that you know, maybe the poem felt itself to be one step ahead of the reader, or tricking them, or whatever.
Yeah.
I always wanted to approach it on a level heading, and so irony really had no place for me in that. I wanted these to be poems that people engaged with on an emotional level primarily, and that was at the heart of the project, really. I never came to them as ideas first. They always, to me, come from an experience or an emotion first.
Yeah.
So I never wanted to add an extra layer of distance or to stylize it to the point that they felt ironic. It's not me. Yeah.
And Steve, I just see Steve's asked a question. We'll come back to that question in a little bit, Steve. If other people have got questions as well, just be thinking of them, be thinking what you want to ask Shawn, and I'll come to those in a little bit. I guess, Shawn, the other thing I was wondering, Tongues of Fire has a kind of real interesting mixture, I think. I'm back, don't worry. Tongues of Fire has within it a very kind of interesting mix, I think, of kind of very short lyric poems and then also kind of long poems. And again, thinking about what's been fashionable or what's been kind of in vogue in the last few years, there has been a notion of kind of shrinking, I guess, certainly of the lyric down to something. In the last few years, the last couple of years especially, I think we've seen a resurgence in the long poem. And some of these poems are kind of fairly long in that sense, and they sustain themselves quite brilliantly. But I just wondered if you had an insight as to why that might be, kind of why you were drawn to the long poem, or what the longer lyric poem can do that that 5 stanzas on one page kind of can't, or what's the difference between those?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm wary of saying what one sort of poem can't do, but I can say what I can't do in a shorter poem and what I can or feel like I can do in a longer poem. First off, I think primarily I wanted to level the reading experience as you go through. I wouldn't have wanted to be all long poems because I think that might be quite exhausting. But neither did I want it to be loads of short poems, which I think can perhaps lose their effect over 80 pages, which the book is, you know, if you're turning over and getting loads of short poems. I find short poems good for dealing with one idea. And you can lean it up against a scene or something and explore that one, or a one moment, or give you one scene. But I feel like with a longer poem, and what I probably do there, I kind of think of them as kind of a braid. And I think that the triplets, I always write the long poems in tercets as well. So 3-line stanzas. And I think there's something flowing about that that's really nice. And it gives me the chance to hold 3 different ideas and bring them together and then contrast them and see how they link. So that's what I'm trying to do. I mean, you mentioned Mark Doty, and he's really the best person there is for that, I think. And just that pressing one idea further and further and further and seeing how far you can take it. And that's what some of these longer poems, I feel, I don't necessarily need them to get to a crescendo or something. I just want to keep on pushing the one thing further and see if I might find something else. Whereas with a short poem, I don't think there's any need to do that. The idea of a short poem is ideally a sort of perfection in some ways, because there's so little room. Whereas with a long poem, you have more idea for more places to turn and to question yourself, and then to go back and see how this thing that you've just noticed fits with another thing, or something like that.
I think that's so interesting, that notion of, Mark Doty always said it, didn't he, that he always wanted a then. His poems always have a then in it. So that quality, as you say, of just, most people would stop the poem, but what if you push it one stanza further or one page further? And that's, I guess, how you end up surprising yourself, isn't it? And that then leads to that quality of surprising the reader. Again, that's one of the things that I'm always trying to tell students, that notion that if we know where the poem's going to go when we start writing it, what's the point, really? Because we won't be surprised by it, then the reader won't be surprised. And I guess, were there things that turned up in those long poems that at the start of the poem you wouldn't have imagined, or that you were kind of surprised by?
Yeah, definitely. I think probably in different senses. Tongues of Fire, the long poem, I basically had it down as a full set of prose notes to begin with, and that was the only one I kind of approached a bit more like an argument, or it had a rhetorical sense to it, I suppose. But for a while I didn't. I finished it and I didn't know fully what the ending meant in a way, and it took me a few readings before I thought, oh yeah, that was what it meant. But it was strange to me that the poem knew something that I didn't know, or I must have known, written it, forgotten, and then it surprised me again. So that was nice. And then, for example, like Tree of Jesse, I'd written I'd been trying for a while to write a poem about just the Tree of Jesse, like a short poem, and it just wasn't working because it was about nothing else apart from the actual structure. And so it took 2 or 3 years before I found something. I found it to be emblematic of something else, and it was re-energized, I suppose, by a new context, and then I could draw things out of it. So yeah, I think the ideal thing is like that you should write a poem, and you should learn more about what you're talking about by the time you finish the poem than you knew when you started. I mean, that's kind of a cliche of all writing, is that if you start out knowing where you're going, that's going to be a pretty dull plod to get there. I mean, I write academic books, so I know that's true. Yeah.
And how does it feel then, I guess, to have, debut books never contain all the poems that we've ever written, because that would be strange, but they feel always like a kind of lifetime's accumulation, I think, don't they? That we've been building towards this moment. So, I just wonder what it's like to have this debut book out in the world, as strange as the world is at the minute.
It's I mean, it's nice. In a way, it's kind of odd though, because you have you gain the book, but you also lose the idea that you might have a book. Do you know what like you lose that constant anticipation of writing something towards something that you don't know what it's going to be, and suddenly everything you've done is put between two covers, sent out, and you're sat there again, and you're like, oh, now I have nothing. Like I have no poems left. So that's odd, and I suppose it takes a while to get used to that. I'm trying to see it as an exciting thing, a blank slate. I can start again, hopefully knowing more and starting from a higher level of my understanding of poetry. So that's nice. But yeah, it's exciting to have a book in the world, and it's nice to see people reading the book, because I suppose you become so familiar with the poems in the book, you almost assume that everyone else knows them, because it's like I know them,
Yeah.
and now it's nice that people are discovering them and reading them freshly.
Fantastic. I want to ask anyone that's kind of listening in. I mean, I can just ask questions all night long because I'm selfish like that. But if people have got questions that they want to type in, I can sort of, if I strain my eyes, just about see them at the bottom of the screen. So if people have got questions that they want to ask Shawn, I can repeat them and we can sort of see where we get to with that, if anyone's got any. But if not, I can just keep asking Shawn the questions that I had. But we'll get sick of my voice, so if anyone else wants to ask a question of the people that join, we're getting a lot of love hearts, Shawn, which is nice. A lot of love hearts popping up down the side of the screen.
Right.
I'm not really sure what that means. People might be doing it accidentally. Their thumb might have slipped. But we'll take it as a compliment, I think. I think we certainly should do. You mentioned the academic books. I mean, you've written one academic book that I think, is it coming out with Oxford University Press next year? Is that right?
Yeah, January, the very.
And then you start working on another one. How does that sit with the poetry? Do you see them as kind of utterly separate things? So you're an academic who's right. I mean, tell us a bit about, I guess, what you write about in the academic sense, but do those two things ever cross over? Or are you a poet and an academic in very kind of separate senses?
I think they inevitably cross over because we write about the things that we learn. I suppose like that does change the way that we write things. So I'm writing a book at the moment on Victorian and modernist literature and engagements with evolutionary science and natural history. So I suppose I'm spending a lot of time reading books on anthropology, on kind of forgotten scientific theories, philosophy and stuff that's a bit defunct now. And I suppose that does come through in that they allow you to see the world in ways that are not the standard way of seeing the world now. So that's nice, and it gives me new routes for thinking about those things. But my way of writing academic texts is much more methodical, I suppose. Like, I can get up in the morning and write 1,000 words of an academic book because like I said, it's an argument. I know where I'm going. I add my footnotes in. That's what I do. Whereas I couldn't do that with a poem. I write very infrequently poetry. One a month is very good going for me. So I'm quite slow.
It's good. We just got a question here, Shawn, that I'll read out for us. It says it's a wonderful debut, which is true. And as well as everything that I've mentioned, kind of nature, the body, queer sensibility, there is this really strong kind of vein of Christian iconography through that book. And the question asks, I guess, whether that's a hangover from childhood, whether that's something you were raised into, and just why you think that kind of finds its way into the poetry.
It's an interesting question, and it's very true. And I wish I had an answer, really, because I suppose I was raised Catholic in the very loosest senses. Like, no, there was no expectation that we would really believe any of it. We would go to church on Sundays sometimes, mostly to appease my grandma. But I suppose I was soaked in the ideas of it. You know, like, I went to a Christian primary school. I went to church. I went on Lord's pilgrimage, but that was to tick a box on my Duke of Edinburgh form. And yeah, I suppose I find the iconography really interesting because it, to me, seems like an existing structure of thought and imagery for thinking about things we don't know. So I refer to God quite a bit throughout the collection. I wouldn't say I believed in God, but I have it as a I suppose I think of God as a really flexible word for everything I don't know, and that's in a way that I invoke it, and all of that imagery is already there to draw on. I suppose it's like people might draw on characters from the classics to think, like Anne Carson might write a book of elegies or about grief, but it's drawing on her work as a classicist, because those figures are already existing, so you don't need to make them up. I'm not a Yeats having to invent an entire spiritual arcana to write poetry. I already have one there, so that's the way I used it, I think. And also, it's just really bodily and odd in some ways, and so I find it really interesting. Like, I'm not a Christian, but I think if I could do a degree again, I might do a theology degree or something really, like, ecclesiastical architecture or something. Like, I just love all the rood screens and the iconography and everything weird and the medieval bleeding bodies and stuff like that. And I love it. So.
Ecclesiastical architecture, that's such a great degree to want to do. Ricardo is asking a question. When did you start to write poetry? Was it in your early teens or kind of later on in adulthood? Kind of when did it first start for you?
I suppose I tried to write poetry when I was about 14 or so.
And what would that have looked like? What would 14-year-old Shawn have been writing about?
I was trying to copy Philip Larkin.
Okay.
That was but with absolutely no life experience or or any insight. So I just that was one thing I tried to do, and then I also wrote very painful. I can remember them. Thankfully, I haven't kept them. Very painful, unrequited love, sort of, crap. And then I suppose I started writing it seriously when I was at university. I was in a poetry group that would meet every fortnight, and that was nice because it pressed me to come up with a poem every fortnight, and we would read each other's and discuss them, and so that's when I started. But none of the poems in the book come from that period. They're all, I think the oldest is probably about 5 years old or so.
Okay, that's Larkin's an interesting one to mention though, because he's someone who, I mean, even if he's not a kind of direct influence on the work that I think we find in Tongues of Fire, there's something about his often sincerity that I do find in your work, or that, I mean, a lot of what we were thinking about, I guess, with irony, is that it seems to me a fear to want to step towards the kind of poetry in case it fails. But where Larkin just had this bravery where he would say what will survive of us is love. He had an ability to want to step towards the poetry and see if it could bear the weight of what he wanted to say. And there's something of that, I think, that more sophisticated than when you were 14, but something of that survived in this book, I think, and in this work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's impossible to love a poet and not have them appear in your work at some point. Like, if you really love them, if you obsess over them, then even if it's just in the cadence of a line or something, or I think my ideal poem kind of follows a Larkinian ascent towards the end, you know, like how he has those amazing ways where he starts off with something really normal, and then by the end it's like, pow, like this is, it just blows it open, and it has this like epiphanic moment at the end.
Yeah.
I think that's something that I always aspire to, and sometimes my worst first drafts of poems, I think, try to do that, and I try to kind of complete something, and then actually I realize the better way of me doing it sometimes is to let things a bit more loose at the end, because tying it up is such a difficult job. I think I mean, I have a few, I suppose I think of perhaps like Ilex, the poem in the book, as having that, or at least the trajectory of a Larkin poem kind of coming through to something semi-religious or epiphanic at the end, but not often. And I suppose what I love about Larkin is you get to know him so well through his work.
Yeah.
You get the sense of grumpiness, vulnerability, meanness, and he doesn't hold it back. You know, like he lets himself be a bad person in the poem, and I think that's kind of important. I don't mind if I come across in some of the poems, I don't know if I do, but as a grumpy person, or as someone you wouldn't like to meet on that day, because like we're not, you know, a poet's job, I don't think is to be virtuous. I think it's to be human, and if you come across as grumpy or whatever else in a poem, then fine.
I think that's a really good point. I think that's really strong. We've got another question down here from D. Valeman, who's just saying, would you ever consider publishing some of the early work, perhaps in a kind of collection of juvenilia, in the future collected poems? Will we ever see some of the work from 14-year-old Shawn?
No, because it doesn't exist anymore. And even if it did,
you've done a Nabokov, you've kind of took it out and just burnt it.
Oh, I don't even know where it went. I probably just threw it away. I did. The one thing that I am kind of sad about burning is we went on holiday to Cornwall once, and I don't know how old I was, about 15 or something. And I took a big A4 notebook with me and started to write a novel, which I thought was going to be like the next The God of Small Things, which was what I was trying to do. And also a bit Daphne du Maurier. So you try and match those two together. It doesn't make any sense. And I kind of wish I kept that, because I think I wrote about 100 pages over 3 weeks or so on a holiday. And I must have thrown it away in embarrassment at some point. But it was all handwritten, and I kind of wish I kept that. But I'm not really sorry to see the end of the...
That could be a lost classic, though.
In the bin somewhere.
Like when I was 15 and I was in America, I decided that I would write a play where this boy that I was in love with, who didn't love me back, got run over. But then it was also a musical where people sang the songs of Michael Jackson.
That sounds like a run.
That has legs. That's got legs, right?
I mean, it's better than Cats.
I mean,
as a
there
concept.
was a weird watch last night. That was a weird thing to watch. Steve Bamlett is just asking, can we say something, or can you say something, about the use of fragments of Irish myth in the middle of the volume? So we've not really mentioned, actually, there's kind of this middle section that's part translation, part kind of versions of Irish myth.
Yeah. Yeah, so they're poems from a Middle Irish tale called Buile Shivna, which is, again, Heaney. Called Sweeney Astray. I decided to get rid of the entire narrative of it and just pick out some lyric moments. But I suppose it came at a point, it is translations, although, so you can find most of the lines, I think, throughout the poem, but I've rearranged them into my own poems. So it's kind of also a found poem translation invention. And I think it came at a time when I'd exhausted the path of writing I was taking up until that point. I felt I had nothing more to say about the things that I was writing about. So I thought I'd try my hand at a translation instead. And it felt to me, through doing that translation, I was also writing about relationships and personal things, but through another voice and in another setting. And so if anyone feels an emotional heart behind Buile Shivna, I think that's me speaking through the text, because the text has some vulnerability in it, but it's not, I don't think you would characterize it as being a lyric text about isolation or relationships that much, but I kind of amplified those moments, and I found it a really useful way of kind of ventriloquizing him as me, and it gave me a bit of distance from myself. So yeah, that's why that was a very jumbled answer.
No, that was great. We've just got a couple more questions, Shawn, and then I think we'll take these two questions, and then I'll ask you just to read something to finish us off. Patricia's not left; she's just took a seat in the stalls to kind of finish watching.
I've never seen her so docile.
The rest, I know, she's so good, right? So Monster in My Poet, which is a great Instagram name, wonders if you feel there is a kind of pressure to end a poem on an epiphany or revelation, or if there are other kind of ends to poems that you would be kind of open to, I guess. And then David789 just asked if you agree with the kind of summary of poetic influences that I put down at the start of the book club. But if we start off with Monster in My Poet's question, so just that notion of, are there other, does every ending to a poem have to be an epiphany, or are there other kind of ways to end a poem?
No, it doesn't. But you can end a poem in as many ways as you can start one, I think. But I actually, I'm a big fan of the disappointed ending. The kind of the disappointment, the bathos, the falling off at the end. Yeah. I'm a really big fan of that, of even building a poem up and then just being honest and saying, you know what, it failed. And I think there's something nice about a poem failing, and those can be some of the most striking poems. I'm trying to think of a good example, but no, definitely not solely epiphanic. I think you have to listen to what a poem wants to do, and sometimes there is no epiphanic moment. It's to complete a thing, and sometimes things aren't completable in that way, I suppose.
Well, I always thought, all poems fail, don't they, to a certain extent, and there's something really interesting about leaning into that failure and kind of accepting it.
Yeah. And I think, well, actually, it's something you learn to do over time. And I actually think the acknowledgement of a failed poem is a sign of maturity, yeah, in your writing as well. Because if you always want to write the perfect poem, you're always going to fail. But if you try and just write a poem, sometimes it might end up with something much closer to perfect than you could have done if you were trying to do it. And you just have to listen to what you're doing at the time. And I'm a big fan of the idea that a poem might reflect the way you are now. And sometimes you're just not, you don't have the energy to complete a poem, or you're depleted in a way, and the fatigue of the poem on the page reflects you, and that's a good thing.
I think that's a really nice way of putting it. So then David's question was just about, I reeled off this kind of list of people who I found in the book, I guess. So Longley, Heaney, Doty, Sharon Old, Gerard Manley Hopkins, I know is a big influence, or kind of presiding spirit. And so David was just wondering if there were any other kind of people that I had neglected to mention, or that maybe were in the background of the book that didn't come out as directly.
I find it hard to think of kind of key influences, because I read a lot and I forget a lot. I forget almost everything I read. I suppose I go to people for models for certain things. So I remember quite consciously going to Danez Smith's Crown of Sonnets, I don't know what it was called, in the first book, Don't Call Us Down. And looking at how he was doing, because I really loved them. And so I looked towards those as a model for shapes of things. But I suppose for influences, it's really hard to tell. I mean, I've read, everyone has read so much stuff in their life. Who knows where it all comes from? There was definitely, there was definitely also a stage when I was looking at Karin Boye, a Swedish poet, Swedish modernist poet, and Thomas Tranströmer as well. So I think those two Swedish poets come through in certain bits.
Fantastic. And just to finish us off, Shawn, do you want to read us another poem from Tongues of Fire?
Yes. I thought I would read Ilex.
Yes. Right.
So this is a poem that I wrote after the birth of my nephew, which I always have to say because everyone thinks that I have a child after I've read it, but I don't. Ilex. Distracting myself, waiting for news. I walked until I saw this white cluster of holly growing at the base of a tree. The stems yellowed, the angled clutch of leaves like a bleached coral, a pale antler, almost medieval, like a relic unearthing in the gloom of the wood. Later, still the baby would not latch, and I came back to this holly, unhardened by the sun, unable to turn the light into strength. May it keep its whiteness. May it never learn the use of spite. Or, in time, when a crown is made of it, may the people approach one by one to witness how a fragile thing is raised.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Shawn.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
I think has worked. I'm as amazed as anyone else, but Tongues of Fire is such a great book. I'm really delighted that it's a Poetry Book Society recommendation for summer 2020. If you have a look on the PBS website, you'll be able to find how to buy it, and check out the Poetry Book Society website for the offer that they've got on at the minute. If you join as a choice member, you'll get a free copy of Rendine, which is Will Harris's book, and was the Poetry Book Society choice for spring 2020. We'll be back hopefully in a couple of weeks with another episode with some more readings and some more chat about the PBS recommendations and choices that we're making this year. So thank you very much, Shawn, for joining us. Thank you very much, Patricia, for just being here. And thank you very much to everyone that stepped in and listened and asked questions. It's been a really great communal experience. Stay safe, stay well, stay at home, and read some poetry.
Thank you, everyone.